The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor of the United Nations building, sending amber liquid splashing across Ambassador Catherine Morrison's designer heels. The heated argument between the Romanian delegate and the Japanese representative had escalated beyond diplomatic protocol, their voices echoing through the hallway in a cacophony of frustrated English, punctuated by sharp bursts of their native tongues. "This is precisely why we need someone who actually understands," Catherine muttered under her breath, dabbing at her shoes with a tissue. She had spent 15 years climbing the diplomatic ladder, mastering the art of international relations, yet here she stood, helpless, as two grown men reduced themselves to gesturing wildly because neither could adequately express their nation's position in a shared language. 3 blocks away, in a cramped diner called Mama Rosa's, Elena Vasquez was simultaneously taking orders from a table of Russian tourists, explaining the daily specials to an elderly Korean gentleman, and mediating a misunderstanding between her Italian boss and a frustrated German businessman who couldn't understand why his credit card was being declined. She moved between languages like a dancer changing partners at a waltz, her voice shifting from the rolling R's of Russian to the precise consonants of German to the melodic tones of Korean, all while balancing 4 plates of Eggs Benedict on her left arm. "Sprechen Sie langsam, bitte," she said gently to the German man, her accent perfect, her tone soothing. "Your card is fine, but our machine doesn't read the chip properly sometimes. Let me try the magnetic strip." She switched to Italian to call to her boss, "Marco, la macchina ha di nuovo problemi," then turned to the Korean gentleman with a warm smile and spoke flawless Korean as she explained that the blueberry pancakes were fresh this morning and made with organic berries from the farmer's market. Elena had dropped out of her linguistics PhD at Columbia 3 years ago when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Now the diner was her world, 48 hours a week, serving customers who saw her as just a waitress with unusual language skills. Her coworker Jamal, a theater major who'd been waiting tables for 8 years while auditioning for roles that never came, often watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Girl, you're wasting your talent in this place," he'd say, wiping down tables at the end of their shifts. "You could be teaching at some fancy university or working for the government or something." Elena would just smile and continue counting her tips. "Bills don't pay themselves," she'd reply, though sometimes, late at night, she'd lie awake calculating how much more money she needed for her mother's next round of treatments, wondering if she had made the right choice. If you're enjoying Elena's incredible journey from waitress to international diplomat, smash that like button and subscribe. It takes just a second, but helps us share more inspiring, true stories like this one. The diner's walls were covered with photographs from the neighborhood's past, immigrants from dozens of countries who had settled in this corner of Manhattan over the past century. Elena knew many of their stories because she had listened to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren tell them in languages their ancestors had brought from home. Mrs. Chen, who came in every Tuesday for tea and toast, spoke to Elena in rapid Cantonese about her grandmother's journey from Guangzhou in 1953. The Moroccan family who owned the jewelry store next door would practice their English with her while she helped them understand tax forms in Arabic. She had become the neighborhood's unofficial translator, helping everyone from Somalian refugees with lease agreements to restaurant owners with menu translations. But today felt different. As Elena served lunch to the usual crowd, a mix of construction workers, office employees grabbing quick meals, and elderly immigrants who treated the diner like their personal social club, she noticed a woman sitting alone in the corner booth. The woman was impeccably dressed, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and the kind of understated jewelry that spoke of old money and established power. She'd been watching Elena for the past hour, not in the casual way of someone impressed by her language skills, but with the focused attention of someone studying a particularly interesting specimen. The woman's name was Catherine Morrison, though Elena didn't know that yet. Catherine had come to the diner on a recommendation from her driver Miguel, who had mentioned a waitress who spoke every language under the sun. At first, Catherine had been skeptical.
She was used to professional interpreters with advanced degrees and security clearances, people who charged $800 a day and still sometimes missed the cultural nuances that could make or break international negotiations. But as she sat in her corner booth, nursing a cup of surprisingly good coffee and watching Elena move seamlessly between conversations in Russian, Korean, Arabic, and Spanish, all while remembering that the businessman at table 6 needed extra cream and the elderly woman by the window was lactose intolerant, Catherine began to reconsider her assumptions about where diplomatic talent might be found. Elena's shift was supposed to end at 3, but Mrs. Petrov, the Russian widow who came in every afternoon, was having problems with her immigration paperwork. The documents were in English, dense with legal terminology, and Mrs. Petrov's English, while functional for daily life, wasn't sufficient for understanding the implications of Form I-485 or the consequences of missing a filing deadline.
"Don't worry, Mrs. Petrov," Elena said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Let me look at this. We'll figure it out together." She spread the papers across the table, her fingers moving quickly across the text as she translated not just the words, but the meaning behind them. In Russian, she explained the timeline, the required documentation, the fees involved, and, most importantly, the hope that lay beneath the bureaucratic language. Catherine found herself leaning forward, straining to hear the conversation. She recognized enough Russian to follow the general topic, but Elena's translation was more than linguistic. It was cultural, emotional, transformative. She was taking the cold, impersonal language of government bureaucracy and turning it into something Mrs. Petrov could understand not just intellectually, but in her heart. When Elena finally finished helping Mrs. Petrov, organizing her documents and writing down a schedule of what needed to be done when, the elderly woman reached across the table and took Elena's hands in both of hers. "Spasiba, daragaya," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, my dear. You give me back my hope." As Mrs. Petrov gathered her papers and left, Catherine rose from her corner booth and approached Elena's table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. That was remarkable." Elena looked up, surprised. She'd noticed the well-dressed woman watching her, but customers sometimes did that, fascinated by the novelty of a waitress who could speak their grandmother's language or help them understand a medical bill. "Oh, thank you," Elena said politely. "Mrs. Petrov needed some help with paperwork. It's no big deal." "Actually, I think it is a very big deal," Catherine said, extending a business card. "I'm Catherine Morrison. I work for the State Department. Could we talk?" Elena took the card, her eyes widening as she read the title. Ambassador Catherine Morrison, Senior Diplomatic Advisor, United Nations Affairs. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that spoke of government budgets and serious business. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Elena said, setting the card down carefully. "I'm just a waitress. I speak some languages, but 12 languages from what I've observed in the past hour. And not just speak them. You understand the cultural context, the emotional undertones, the unspoken implications. That's not just anything. That's a rare and valuable skill." Elena felt her heart racing. "You've been watching me?" "Professionally," Catherine clarified. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vasquez, Elena Vasquez. Miss Vasquez, what I witnessed today isn't something you learn in a classroom or pick up from language tapes. You have an intuitive understanding of how people communicate across cultural barriers. That's exactly what we need." The diner suddenly felt too small, the familiar sounds of clinking plates and casual conversation fading into background noise. Elena was aware of Jamal watching from behind the counter, of Marco emerging from the kitchen to see why she wasn't clearing tables, of the weight of possibilities hanging in the air like smoke. "What kind of proposition?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew what the answer would be. "I want to offer you a position with the State Department, starting immediately, full salary, benefits, and the chance to use your skills on an international stage. We have situations developing right now where someone with your abilities could make a real difference."
Elena's first instinct was to laugh. The idea was absurd. A PhD dropout working as a waitress suddenly offered a job with the State Department? But Catherine's expression was completely serious, her posture suggesting that this was not an offer she made lightly. "I appreciate the offer, I really do," Elena said slowly. "But I can't just leave. I have responsibilities here, commitments. My mother is sick, and the insurance doesn't cover everything. I need this job. We can discuss salary later, but I can guarantee it would be significantly more than you're making here. More than enough to cover your mother's medical expenses and give you the financial security to plan for the future." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. How did the stranger know about her mother? How much did she know, and what did that mean? Catherine seemed to read her expression. "I apologize if I've overstepped. When I'm considering someone for a sensitive position, I do my homework. Your mother is receiving treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Stage 3 breast cancer, currently in remission, but requiring ongoing monitoring. You've been paying for treatments not covered by her Medicare plan. You dropped out of Columbia's linguistics program in your second year of doctoral studies to work full-time. You've been sending money home to support not just your mother's medical expenses, but also helping your younger brother finish his engineering degree at SUNY." Elena felt exposed, vulnerable, as if all her carefully constructed privacy had been stripped away. "You investigated me?"
"I verified the information that was readily available," Catherine said gently. "Elena, you've been invisible for too long. Your professors at Columbia still ask about you. Dr. Martinez told me your dissertation proposal was groundbreaking. Something about how multilingual speakers develop unique neural pathways that affect their ability to mediate cultural conflicts. You were on track to become a leading researcher in the field." The mention of Dr. Martinez sent a sharp pang through Elena's chest. She remembered the last conversation she'd had with her advisor, the disappointment in his eyes when she explained that she couldn't continue the program. He'd offered to help her find funding, suggested she take a leave of absence rather than dropping out entirely, but Elena had been drowning in medical bills and family obligations. The decision had felt inevitable, even if it broke her heart. "That was a long time ago," Elena said quietly. "It was 3 years ago. In academic terms, that's nothing. Your research could still be relevant, still make an impact. But right now, I'm more interested in your practical skills. What you did for Mrs. Petrov today, that's diplomacy in its purest form. You took a complex, emotionally charged situation and found a way to create understanding and hope. That's what we need at the international level." Elena looked around the diner, at Jamal wiping down tables, at Marco calling orders from the kitchen, at the familiar faces of customers who had become like family over the past 3 years. This place had been her refuge, her stability, her identity. The thought of leaving felt like betraying everyone who had supported her. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Catherine said, standing up, "but I want you to know that this opportunity won't wait indefinitely. We have a situation developing that requires immediate attention. The Romanian and Japanese delegates I mentioned earlier, their conflict is just the tip of the iceberg. We have 6 different nations involved in a trade dispute that's threatening to escalate into something much more serious. Traditional diplomatic channels have failed because everyone is talking past each other. We need someone who can hear what's actually being said beneath the official positions." She paused at the edge of Elena's table, her expression softening slightly. "Elena, I've been in this business for 15 years. I've worked with the best interpreters, the most skilled negotiators, the most highly educated diplomatic minds in the world. What I saw you do today, the way you connected with Mrs. Petrov, the way you understood not just her words but her heart, that's not something you can teach or learn from a textbook. That's a gift." Catherine placed a second business card on the table, this one with a different number. "My personal cell phone. Think about it, but don't think too long. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that scare us the most." As Catherine walked out of the diner, Elena sat alone at the table, staring at the business cards as if they might transform into something more familiar, less threatening. Around her, the afternoon crowd was thinning out, the familiar rhythms of the diner continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The careful balance she'd built over the past 3 years, work, family obligations, the small satisfactions of helping her neighborhood community, suddenly felt precarious.
Jamal appeared at her table with a fresh cup of coffee. "Girl, who was that woman? She looked like she could buy this whole block and turn it into condos." "Someone offering me a different life," Yelena said, surprised by her own honesty. "Is the difference good or scary?" Yelena picked up one of Catherine's business cards, feeling the weight of the expensive paper between her fingers. Through the diner's front window, she could see the United Nations building in the distance, its flags representing countries from around the world, languages and cultures and conflicts she knew only from textbooks and news reports. "I don't know yet. Both, maybe." As Yelena finished her shift, she found herself paying attention to details she usually took for granted. The way Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up when Yelena spoke to her in Cantonese. The gratitude in the Somalian teenager's voice when Yelena helped him understand his work schedule. The trust that people placed in her, the way they opened up when someone finally understood not just their words, but their world. For 3 years, she had told herself that this was enough, that helping people on a small scale was meaningful work. But Catherine's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that scare us the most. As Yelena hung up her apron and gathered her things, she realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was afraid of making the wrong choice rather than afraid of not having any choices at all. And that, she thought, might be the beginning of hope. Yelena's apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better decades. The radiator clanged through the night like an ancient percussion section, and the thin walls meant she knew more about her neighbors' lives than she'd ever wanted to know. But the rent was affordable, the bodega downstairs sold decent coffee, and Mrs. Rodriguez in 4B had been teaching her Portuguese in exchange for help with English pronunciation. She climbed the stairs slowly that evening, her feet aching from 8 hours of standing. Catherine's business cards burning a hole in her pocket like unspoken secrets. The familiar smell of her neighbor's cooking, Mrs. Kim's kimchi stew tonight, usually comforted her, but now it reminded her of all the languages she spoke, all the cultures she understood, all the potential Catherine claimed she was wasting. Her apartment was small, but meticulously organized. Books in 12 languages lined makeshift shelves built from cinder blocks and plywood. Her laptop sat on a tiny kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of medical bills, insurance forms, and the occasional academic journal she still couldn't resist buying. The walls were covered with photographs. Her mother before the diagnosis, radiant in her nursing uniform. Her brother Miguel at his high school graduation. Herself at Columbia, young and confident, and certain that the world was full of possibilities. Elena made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her table, pulling out her phone to call her mother. This was their daily ritual, a check-in call where Elena pretended everything was fine, and her mother pretended she wasn't worried about her daughter sacrificing her future for medical bills. "Mija?" Her mother's voice was warm despite the underlying exhaustion that had become her constant companion since chemotherapy. "How was your day, Elena?" "Good, Mama. Busy. The usual crowd at the diner." Elena found herself hesitating. She'd always told her mother everything. But how do you explain that a stranger had just offered you a chance to reclaim the life you'd given up? How do you admit that you'd been lying when you said you were happy, that serving eggs Benedict and translating immigration paperwork wasn't fulfilling enough to justify abandoning your dreams? "You sound different, Elena. Distracted." Her mother had always been able to read her voice, even across the distance between Manhattan and the Bronx. "Just tired, I think. How are you feeling? Did you have your appointment with Dr. Williams today?" "Yes, and the tests look good. Very good. She said if things continue like this, we might be able to space out the visits, maybe reduce some of the medications." There was hope in her mother's voice, fragile and precious. "Elena, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you went back to school." The words hit Elena like cold water. "Mama, we've talked about this. I can't afford—" "Listen to me, Mija. I'm getting better. The insurance is covering more now that we're past the experimental stage. Miguel graduates next month, and he already has 2 job offers. We don't need you to carry this burden anymore." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of sacrifice pressing down on her shoulders. She had become so used to being the responsible one, the one who made the hard choices and paid the bills, that the idea of pursuing her own dreams felt almost foreign. "It's not that simple, Mama. I can't just walk back into Colombia after 3 years and Dr. Martinez called me last week." Elena's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" "He calls sometimes, check on how you're doing. He says you could restart the program, that there's funding available for students in your situation. He never stopped believing in your research, Elena." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Elena barely heard the rest of it. Dr. Martinez had been calling her mother? Her research advisor, whom she hadn't spoken to since the day she'd formally withdrawn from the program, had been keeping track of her progress, waiting for her to come back? After hanging up, Elena sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, too restless to turn on the lights. Catherine's business card lay on the table next to a stack of linguistic journals, 2 different paths illuminated by the glow of her laptop screen. She opened her computer and found herself browsing the State Department website, reading about diplomatic careers, cultural attaché positions, and international negotiation programs. The salary ranges were staggering, more money than she'd ever imagined making, enough to pay off her mother's medical debt and still have money left for herself. But it was the job descriptions that really caught her attention. Facilitate cross-cultural communication in high-stakes international negotiations. Serve as cultural interpreter for sensitive diplomatic missions. Bridge language and cultural barriers to prevent international conflicts. It sounded like everything she dreamed of during her graduate studies, everything she'd thought she'd given up forever. But doubt crept in as quickly as excitement. She was a waitress who dropped out of school. What did she know about international diplomacy, about the complex world of treaties and trade agreements and political maneuverings? The customers at the diner trusted her to translate their parking tickets and medical forms, not to prevent international incidents. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Martinez's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for 10 minutes before she finally dialed. "Elena? Is that really you?" "Hi, Dr. Martinez. I'm sorry to call so late, but, well, something happened today, and I needed to talk to someone who would understand."
Of course. I have all the time in the world. Tell me everything. She found herself spilling the entire story. Catherine's appearance at the diner, the job offer, her confusion about whether she was qualified for something so far beyond her current experience. Dr. Martinez listened without interrupting, the way he'd always done during their advising sessions. "Elena," he said when she finished, "do you remember your dissertation proposal?" "Of course I remember it. Phonemic convergence in multilingual urban environments. I was studying how people who speak multiple languages develop unique neural pathways that affect their ability to mediate cultural conflicts." "And what was your primary research question?" Elena smiled despite her anxiety. Dr. Martinez always brought conversations back to the fundamentals. "I wanted to understand whether truly multilingual individuals, not just people who learned languages academically, but those who grew up switching between linguistic communities, whether they develop enhanced abilities for cultural translation that go beyond simple language interpretation." "And what was your hypothesis?" "That multilingual individuals who learned languages through cultural immersion rather than formal education develop intuitive abilities for cultural mediation that can't be replicated through traditional diplomatic training." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Elena, do you hear what you just said?" Elena stopped, the implications of her own words sinking in. "Oh. You didn't abandon your research when you left Colombia. You've been conducting it for the past 3 years, every single day, in that diner. You've been proving your hypothesis through practical application. What that diplomat saw today wasn't just language skills. It was the exact phenomenon you wanted to study."
Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. But I don't have the formal training, the security clearances, Elena, I've been in academia for 30 years. I've seen brilliant students with perfect GPAs and flawless credentials who couldn't mediate a conflict between two freshman roommates. Which you have, this intuitive understanding of how language and culture intersect, that's not something you can teach, that's something you're born with and develop through experience. They talked for another hour. Dr. Martinez telling her about former students who had gone on to work for the State Department, the CIA, international NGOs. He described a world where her skills wouldn't just be appreciated, but desperately needed, where the kind of cultural bridge building she did at the diner could prevent conflicts between nations. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Martinez said as their conversation wound down. "I've been keeping your research materials, your preliminary findings, all your notes. They're here in my office, waiting for you whenever you're ready to come back. Whether that's next month or next decade, the work you started is still here." After hanging up, Elena sat in her dark apartment, feeling as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about her choices, her sacrifices, her future, was suddenly open to question. She spent the next 3 days in a strange state of suspension, going through the motions of her regular routine while her mind spun through possibilities and fears. At the diner, she found herself paying attention to her interactions with customers in a new way, analyzing her own thought processes as she switched between languages and cultural contexts. When the Ethiopian restaurant owner Almaz came in for her usual Tuesday lunch, Elena noticed how she automatically adjusted not just her language, but her entire approach to communication. With Almaz, she spoke Amharic softly, with the indirect respectfulness that was expected when addressing someone older and more established in the community. But when Almaz's teenage daughter joined them and began complaining about her math teacher in rapid English peppered with Amharic phrases, Elena seamlessly shifted to match the girl's more direct American communication style while still maintaining the cultural awareness of family hierarchy. "You see both worlds," Alam said to Elena in Amharic as her daughter went to use the restroom. "That's a gift, but also a burden. You understand too much sometimes." She stared at her, struck by the accuracy of the observation. Understanding too much. Wasn't that exactly what made her good at cultural mediation, but also what made simple solutions impossible? On Wednesday, she helped resolve a conflict between the Polish carpenter and the Dominican electrician that had been simmering for weeks. The issue wasn't just language, it was different approaches to time, different ways of expressing disagreement, different cultural expectations about how business relationships should work. Elena found herself translating not just words, but entire worldviews, helping each man understand that what he interpreted as disrespect was actually just a different way of showing professionalism. On Thursday, Catherine called. "I hope you don't mind," she said, "but I took the liberty of observing your work again yesterday. I was having lunch at the Ethiopian place next door when you helped resolve that construction dispute." Elena felt a flash of annoyance. "You're still watching me?" "I'm evaluating whether my initial assessment was correct. And Elena, what I saw yesterday confirmed everything I suspected. You don't just speak 12 languages. You think in 12 different cultural frameworks. That's extraordinarily rare." "What exactly would this job involve?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "Initially, a trial period, working with a small team on the trade dispute I mentioned. 6 countries, all convinced the others are acting in bad faith, all missing the cultural signals that would help them understand what's really happening. We've been deadlocked for 3 months. And you think I could help break the deadlock? I think you could help them understand what they're actually fighting about versus what they think they're fighting about. Sometimes conflicts persist not because the issues are insurmountable, but because people are having completely different conversations without realizing it." Elena found herself thinking about Mrs. Petrov, about the way the immigration forms had seemed impossibly complex until Elena translated them not just linguistically, but culturally, explaining not just what the government wanted, but why they wanted it, and how to navigate the underlying assumptions. What would happen if I failed? Then we'd be exactly where we are now, and you'd have gained invaluable experience working at the international level. But, Elena, I don't think you'll fail. I think you'll discover that what you've been doing in that diner is exactly what the world needs more of. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. I need to talk to my family. Of course, but I do need an answer soon. How does Friday sound? After hanging up, Elena realized she was shaking. Friday was 2 days away. 2 days to decide between the life she'd built and the life she'd dreamed of, between security and possibility, between serving Eggs Benedict and potentially serving her country. That evening, she called Miguel, her younger brother. At 23, he had their mother's optimism and their father's practical intelligence, plus an engineering degree that was about to launch him into a successful career. Elena, you have to take this job, he said without hesitation, after she'd explained the situation. Are you kidding me? This is everything you wanted. It's not that simple, Miguel. What if I'm not good enough? What if I embarrass myself? What if you spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to try? His words echoed in her mind as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to her neighbor's television through the thin walls. What if she spent the rest of her life wondering? On Friday morning, Elena called Catherine before her shift at the diner began. I'll do it, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll try. Elena, that's wonderful. When can you start? Before we continue with Elena's dramatic career transformation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more stories of people who changed their lives against all odds. I need to give Marco 2 weeks' notice. He's been good to me, and it's not fair to leave him short-staffed. Actually, we need you Monday. This situation has become urgent. I can arrange for the State Department to compensate the diner for any inconvenience, and I can guarantee that if things don't work out, you'll have a reference that will open doors anywhere you want to work. Elena closed her eyes, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. Monday? Monday. Elena, I know this is scary. Change always is, but you're not jumping into the unknown alone. You'll have a full support team, training resources, and most importantly, you'll be using skills you've already proven you possess. After hanging up, Elena sat in her small apartment for a long time, surrounded by books in 12 languages and photographs of the life she'd built through careful compromise and sacrifice. Then she opened her laptop and began researching everything she could about international trade disputes, cultural diplomacy, and the 6 countries that were about to become her responsibility. She had 3 days to prepare for the most important challenge of her life. 3 days to transform from Elena the waitress to Elena the cultural diplomat. 3 days to discover whether her dreams were as resilient as her hope. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Manhattan feel full of possibilities. Elena stood outside the United Nations building at 7:30 a.m., wearing the single professional suit she owned, a navy blue ensemble she'd bought for job interviews 3 years ago, and had worn exactly twice since then. In her hands, she clutched a leather portfolio that Dr. Martinez had given her as a graduation gift from Columbia, now filled with notes about international trade law and cultural communication strategies she'd studied frantically over the weekend. Catherine met her at security, moving through the checkpoint with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this world of marble corridors and flags from every nation on Earth. Elena followed, trying to project calm while internally cataloging every detail. The way conversations happened in clusters of 3 or 4 languages simultaneously, the subtle hierarchies visible in how people position themselves during informal discussions, the weight of history that seemed to press down from the high ceilings. "Your first meeting is in 20 minutes, Catherine said as they rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. "I want you to observe today. Get a feel for the dynamics. Don't feel pressured to contribute unless something strikes you as important." Elena nodded, her mouth too dry to trust her voice. Through the elevator's glass walls, she could see the city spreading out below them, looking manageable from this height. Down there, people were starting their normal days, going to diners, taking orders, translating parking tickets. Up here, people made decisions that affected millions of lives. The conference room was elegant in the way that expensive things often were, understated but unmistakably costly. A massive table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Elena made in a month. Representatives from 6 countries were already seated, each with a small nameplate and flag, creating a united nation in miniature. Elena took her place at a smaller table to the side, designated for advisors and staff, and pulled out a notebook. As the meeting began, she found herself automatically cataloging not just what people were saying, but how they were saying it, where they looked when they spoke, what their posture revealed about their comfort level and cultural expectations. The Romanian delegate, Alexandru Petrescu, was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of formal bearing that spoke of decades in government service. He spoke English perfectly, but Elena could hear the underlying structure of Romanian in his word choices, the way he constructed arguments with a logical progression that was valued in Eastern European academic tradition. The Japanese representative, Hiroshi Tanaka, was younger, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and a tendency to pause thoughtfully before speaking. His English was also flawless, but Elena noticed how he used silence as a communication tool, how he bowed slightly when making important points, even while seated, and how he structured his arguments to avoid direct contradiction while still expressing disagreement. Within 10 minutes, Elena saw the problem. They weren't having the same conversation. The Romanian delegate spoke directly, while the Japanese representative communicated indirectly, and neither understood the other's cultural approach. The issue at hand was a trade agreement involving rare earth minerals, with complex implications for technology manufacturing, environmental protection, and economic development. 6 countries had been negotiating for 8 months, and every session devolved into the same circular arguments about transparency, environmental standards, and fair pricing. Elena watched as Alexandru became increasingly frustrated with what he interpreted as Hiroshi's evasiveness, while Hiroshi became more formal and indirect in response to what he perceived as Alexandru's aggressive confrontational style. The other delegates from Brazil, Kenya, Sweden, and Canada had chosen sides, creating 2 camps that were becoming more entrenched with every exchange. "If Japan cannot provide clear assurance about production capacity," Alexandru said, his voice rising slightly, "how can we proceed with confidence?" Hiroshi's response was carefully measured. "We appreciate Romania's concern for transparency. Perhaps there are ways to address information sharing that honor all parties' needs." Elena found herself writing furiously in her notebook, not just recording the words, but analyzing the cultural subtext. Alexandru heard Hiroshi's response as a non-answer, a way of avoiding commitment. But Elena could see that Hiroshi was actually trying to signal willingness to compromise while maintaining face for his negotiating team, a crucial concept in Japanese business culture. The meeting continued for 2 hours, growing more tense as each delegate became more entrenched in their position. Elena filled 12 pages with notes, mapping the cultural miscommunications that were creating artificial barriers to agreement. When the meeting finally ended with no progress and another session scheduled for the following day, Catherine approached Elena's table. "What did you observe?" Elena looked down at her notes, feeling suddenly uncertain. These were experienced diplomats with decades of training. Who was I to think I understood something they had missed? I think they're arguing about different things, she said quietly. What do you mean?
Elena pointed to her notes. Mr. Petrescu keeps asking for concrete commitments and specific numbers. In Romanian business culture, that's how you show respect, by being direct and factual. But Mr. Tanaka interprets directness as aggression, so he responds with more indirectness, which Mr. Petrescu then interprets as evasion. Catherine sat down beside her. Go on. Mr. Tanaka is trying to build consensus gradually, which is appropriate in Japanese negotiation style. He's actually signaling flexibility, but he's doing it in ways that the others can't recognize. When he says, perhaps there are ways, he's opening the door to compromise, but everyone else hears it as a delaying tactic. Elena paused, looking around the now empty conference room. And the environmental concerns that the Swedish and Canadian delegates keep raising? They're not really about the environment. They're about economic leverage. But they can't say that directly because it would undermine their public positions. So they're using environmental language as a proxy for economic negotiations. Catherine's expression was unreadable. Those are sophisticated observations, Elena. What would you suggest? I think they need to have different conversations, maybe separate the cultural concerns from the technical issues. Let people communicate in the styles that feel natural to them, but with someone who can translate not just the words, but the intentions. Catherine smiled for the first time since Elena had met her. I want you to sit in on tomorrow's meeting, not as an observer, as a participant. That evening, Elena called Jamal at the diner. She'd been so focused on preparing for her new role that she hadn't properly processed leaving her old life behind. Girl, you're at the United Nations? Like, the actual United Nations with all the flags and everything? It doesn't feel real, Elena admitted. Today, I sat in a room where people were making decisions about millions of dollars in trade agreements, and I kept thinking I should be asking if they wanted more coffee. But you're good at it, right? I mean, you always helped everyone at the diner figure their stuff out. That's just it, Jamal. This is like the diner, but instead of helping Mrs. Petrov with immigration forms, I'm supposed to help countries understand each other. The scale is terrifying. Elena, remember when that Korean businessman and the Dominican contractor almost got into a fight over the construction permit for the bodega next to the door? You sat them down, and within 10 minutes, they were laughing and planning to work together. Same skill, bigger room. After hanging up, Elena spent the evening researching each of the 6 countries involved in the negotiations. Not just their economic positions, but their cultural approaches to conflict resolution, their historical relationships with each other, their internal political pressures that might be influencing their negotiating positions. She discovered that Romania had been excluded from several previous trade agreements and was desperate to prove they could be reliable partners. Japan was facing pressure from domestic manufacturers who needed guaranteed access to rare earth minerals, but couldn't appear to be capitulating to foreign demands. Brazil was caught between environmental groups and mining interests. Kenya was trying to position itself as a gateway to African markets. Sweden was balancing EU requirements with domestic political concerns. Canada was managing complex relationships with both American and Chinese interests. The more Elena researched, the more she realized that the technical details of the trade agreement were almost secondary to the web of cultural and political pressures each delegate was navigating. Tuesday's meeting began exactly like Monday's. Formal greetings, careful positioning, the same circular arguments. But this time, Elena had a seat at the main table. 20 minutes into the session, when Alexandru began showing obvious frustration with Hiroshi's indirect responses, Elena spoke for the first time. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended. "I think there might be a communication issue here." The room fell silent. Elena felt 6 pairs of eyes focused on her,
along with Catherine's encouraging nod from across the table. Elena continued, switching to Romanian. Mr. Petrescu, when you ask for specific production numbers, you're showing respect for Mr. Tanaka's expertise and trying to build trust through transparency, correct? Alexandru looked surprised to hear his native language in this context, but nodded. Exact. This is how serious business is conducted. Elena turned to Hiroshi and switched to Japanese. And Tanaka-san, when you speak of finding ways to address concerns, you're indicating willingness to be flexible while maintaining harmony for your team, yes?
Hiroshi's eyebrows rose slightly. That is very perceptive. Yes. Elena looked around the table, switching back to English. I think you're both trying to accomplish the same thing, build trust and move forward. But you're using different cultural approaches. Mr. Petrescu, in Japanese business culture, direct requests for specific commitments can be interpreted as pressure, which creates loss of face. Mr. Tanaka, in Romanian culture, indirect responses can seem like avoidance, which creates distrust. She paused, her heart racing. What if we restructured this conversation? Instead of asking for commitments, what if we explored possibilities? Instead of defending positions, what if we identified shared concerns? The Brazilian delegate, Maria Santos, leaned forward. What would that look like practically? Elena felt a surge of confidence. This was exactly like mediating between the Polish carpenter and the Dominican electrician, just with higher stakes. For example, everyone is concerned about reliable supply chains. Instead of arguing about specific numbers, what if each country explained what reliability means in their context? I suspect we'll find that you're all looking for the same thing, just defining it differently. For the next hour, Elena facilitated a completely different kind of conversation. Instead of formal position statements, delegates shared their underlying concerns. Instead of defending their country's demands, they explored what success would look like for everyone involved. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that the Swedish delegate, Eric Lindquist, was using environmental concerns to mask economic anxieties about competition from Canadian mining operations. By addressing the economic issues directly in a private sidebar conversation conducted in Swedish, Elena helped Eric articulate concerns that the group could actually address. This is remarkable, the Kenyan delegate, Grace Wanjipu, said as the meeting ended. We've made more progress in 2 hours than we have in 2 months. But Elena's success in Tuesday's meeting created new problems. By Wednesday, word had spread through the UN building that a waitress with no diplomatic training was somehow succeeding where experienced negotiators had failed. The reactions were mixed, and not all of them were positive. Dr. James Harrison, a senior international diplomatic advisor who had been working on the trade dispute for 6 months, cornered Elena after Wednesday's session. I understand you've been helpful, he said, his tone suggesting that helpful was not necessarily a good thing. But I hope you understand that international diplomacy is more complex than translating dinner orders. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm not trying to replace anyone's expertise. I'm just trying to help people understand each other. Understanding is one thing, but there are protocols, precedents, legal implications that require years of training to navigate properly. What happens when your cultural insights create commitments that can't be legally enforced? What happens when you promise something that violates international trade law? Dr. Harrison's concerns weren't entirely unfair. Elena had been so focused on facilitating communication that she hadn't considered the broader implications of the agreements being reached. She spent that evening studying international trade law, trying to understand the legal framework that constrained what felt like natural solutions. Thursday brought a new crisis. The Romanian delegate arrived with new instructions from his government. Apparently, Elena's success had raised expectations in Bucharest, and Alexandru was now under pressure to secure more favorable terms than had previously been discussed. My government believes that if we can achieve such rapid progress, perhaps we have been too modest in our initial requests, Alexandru explained to Elena privately before the meeting began. Elena felt a knot forming in her stomach. Mr. Petrescu, the progress we've made is based on everyone feeling heard and respected. If you change your position dramatically now, it could undermine everything we've built.
But surely you can help the others understand our enhanced position. You have such skill with cultural translation." Elena realized she was facing her first major ethical dilemma in her new role. Alexandru was asking her to use her cultural insights to manipulate the other delegates, to help Romania extract more favorable terms by exploiting the trust and goodwill that had been established. "I can't do that," Elena said firmly. "My role is to help everyone communicate clearly, not to advocate for any particular country's position." Alexandru's expression cooled. "I see. Perhaps your loyalties are not as clear as we assumed." The accusation hit Elena like a physical blow. In trying to be fair to everyone, was she being loyal to no one? Was neutrality even possible in international negotiations, or was she naively trying to stand in the middle of forces much larger than herself? Thursday's meeting was tense from the beginning. Alexandru presented Romania's new demands with the kind of aggressive directness that Elena now recognized would trigger defensive responses. But when she tried to soften the language, to help him present his country's position in ways that the others could hear, Alexandru interrupted her.
"I think Ms. Vasquez's translation may not fully capture the strength of Romania's position," he said coldly. Elena felt the room's dynamic shift. The trust that had been building over the week began to crack as delegates realized that Elena's neutrality might not be as reliable as they had assumed. Hiroshi spoke carefully. "Perhaps it would be helpful to clarify Ms. Vasquez's role in these proceedings." Catherine stepped in smoothly. "Elena is here to facilitate communication, not to advocate for any particular position. Her insights have been valuable precisely because of her neutrality." But the damage was done. For the rest of the meeting, delegates were more guarded, more formal, more like they had been on Monday. The natural flow of conversation that Elena had helped create was replaced by careful positioning and defensive language. When the meeting ended with minimal progress, Elena felt like she had failed everyone. She had spent 3 days building bridges that were now crumbling because she hadn't anticipated how success might create its own problems. Dr. Harrison approached her as delegates filed out of the conference room. "This is what I was trying to warn you about," he said, not unkindly. "Diplomacy isn't just about helping people understand each other. It's about managing competing interests, legal constraints, political pressures, and unintended consequences. Good intentions aren't enough." That evening, Elena called Dr. Martinez. "I think I made a mistake," she said without preamble. "I thought this would be like the diner, like helping Mrs. Petrov with her immigration forms, but it's not. There are all these layers I didn't understand, all these ways that helping one person can hurt someone else." Dr. Martinez listened as Elena described the week's events, her voice breaking as she admitted her fears that she had been naive, that she was in over her head, that she might have made things worse rather than better. "Elena," he said when she finished, "do you remember what your research hypothesis was?" "That multilingual individuals develop enhanced abilities for cultural mediation." "And what did you observe this week?" Elena paused, thinking. "That I could help people understand each other's underlying concerns, that a lot of conflict comes from cultural miscommunication rather than actual disagreement. And what did you learn about the limitations of cultural mediation? That understanding isn't enough if people don't want to use that understanding constructively, that neutrality is harder to maintain when the stakes are high, that good communication can create new problems if it's not supported by good systems." Dr. Martinez's voice was warm. "Elena, those are exactly the insights your research was designed to uncover. You haven't failed. You've discovered the boundaries of your hypothesis. The question now is, what do you do with that knowledge?" Elena spent Friday morning preparing for what she assumed would be her final meeting with the trade negotiation team. She had notes about how to transition the discussions back to the formal diplomatic process, how to preserve the progress that had been made while acknowledging that her approach had reached its limits. But when she arrived at the conference room, she found a surprise waiting for her. All 6 delegates were already there, along with Catherine and Dr. Harrison. They'd been meeting since 7 a.m.
Elena, Catherine said as she entered, we've been discussing yesterday's challenges and we have a proposal. Grace Wanjiku, the Kenyan delegate, spoke first. We've realized that what happened yesterday wasn't a failure of communication, it was politics interfering with communication. We want to separate those two things. Eric Lindquist nodded. We would like to continue working with you on the cultural and communication aspects of our negotiations, but we also want Dr. Harrison and his team to handle the legal and political frameworks. Maria Santos added, think of it as parallel processes. You help us understand what we really want, and the legal team helps us figure out how to get it within the constraints of international law. Elena looked around the room, surprised by this turn of events. And, Mr. Petrescu, how do you feel about this approach? Alexandru's expression was thoughtful. I spoke with my government last night. They understand that pushing too hard, too fast, could jeopardize the entire agreement. They've authorized me to return to our original position and work within this new framework.
Elena felt a cautious hope beginning to build. What would my role be exactly? Dr. Harrison answered, you would continue facilitating the cultural communication aspects of our meetings. I would handle legal review and procedural compliance. Catherine would coordinate between both tracks and manage political pressures. Think of it as a new model for international negotiation, Catherine added. Cultural intelligence supported by legal expertise and political management. If it works, it could change how diplomatic discussions happen. Elena looked down at her notes, then around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past week. Are you sure you want to trust a waitress with something this important? Hiroshi smiled, the first time Elena had seen him express emotions so directly. We want to trust someone who remembers that behind every position is a person, and behind every person is a culture that deserves respect. As they settled in for Friday's session, Elena realized that her first week in diplomacy had taught her something crucial. Success wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking better questions, building better systems, and remaining humble enough to learn from both victories and failures. The real work was just beginning. Elena felt a surge of confidence. This was exactly like mediating between the Polish carpenter and the Dominican electrician, just with higher stakes. Elena had been keeping detailed notes on not just the cultural dynamics between delegates, but on the internal contradictions she observed within each country's positions. Romania wanted to be seen as a reliable partner, but kept changing their demands. Japan wanted flexibility, but insisted on rigid procedures. Brazil wanted environmental protection, but also economic development. Every delegate was trying to serve multiple masters, and the resulting internal tensions were creating impossible negotiating positions. What if we helped each country clarify their own priorities before they try to negotiate with others? Elena suggested during Friday's planning meeting with Catherine and Dr. Harrison. Catherine raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we mediate internal government processes? Not mediate, facilitate. Help people identify their primary goals versus their secondary concerns. Right now, everyone is treating everything as equally important, which makes compromise impossible. Dr. Harrison was skeptical. Internal government decision-making is beyond our mandate. We're here to facilitate international negotiations, not to interfere with domestic politics. But Elena had been observing something that the formal diplomatic process had missed. Each delegate was under pressure from multiple constituencies at home, creating positions that tried to satisfy everyone and therefore satisfied no one. Alexandru was balancing between Romanian mining interests, environmental groups, and EU pressure. Hiroshi was managing Japanese manufacturers, trade unions, and foreign ministry protocols. Maria was juggling Brazilian federal environmental policy, state-level mining interests, and international development commitments. What if we created space for each delegate to work through their internal priorities with cultural support? Elena proposed.
not telling them what to prioritize, but helping them understand how their cultural background affects how they frame their choices. Catherine was intrigued despite her initial skepticism. What would that look like practically? Elena pulled out her notebook, filled with observations from 3 weeks of meetings. For example, Mr. Petrescu keeps saying Romania wants to be a reliable partner, but he defines reliability in terms of Romanian cultural values, consistency, directness, meeting commitments exactly as stated. But the other delegates define reliability differently. If we helped him understand how reliability is perceived in other cultures, he might be able to develop positions that actually achieve his goal of being seen as reliable. She flipped to another page, and Tanaka-san talks about harmonious solutions, but he's defining harmony in purely Japanese terms, avoiding conflict, preserving face, building consensus gradually. If he understood how other cultures approach harmony, he might find ways to achieve his goals that the others could recognize and support. Dr. Harrison looked thoughtful. You're suggesting cultural coaching for individual delegates? Cultural reflection, Elena corrected, helping people understand how their cultural background shapes their negotiation style, their priorities, and their definition of success. Catherine made a decision. Let's try it. Elena, I want you to schedule individual sessions with each delegate, 30 minutes each, focused on helping them clarify their own positions before we reconvene for group discussions.
The individual sessions revealed layers of complexity that had been invisible during group meetings. When Elena met with Alexandru privately, speaking in Romanian, he admitted that his government's constantly changing demands were actually a sign of their inexperience with international negotiations. "We want to be strong negotiators," Alexandru said, "but we're not sure what strength looks like in this context." In Romanian business culture, strength means never backing down, never showing weakness. But I think this is actually making us appear unreliable. Elena nodded. What if strength meant something different in international negotiations? What if it meant being secure enough in your position to show flexibility? How do I explain that to Bucharest? What matters most to Romania? Being respected or being feared? Alexandru considered this. Respected. We want to be seen as a country others want to work with. Then maybe strength means demonstrating that Romania can be trusted to find solutions that work for everyone, not just for Romania. When Elena met with Hiroshi, she discovered that his indirect communication style was actually creating problems within his own negotiating team. His younger staff members, who had been educated in American business schools, were frustrated by what they saw as unnecessarily complex communication. "I am trying to maintain proper diplomatic protocol," Hiroshi explained in Japanese, "but my own team sometimes misunderstands my instructions." Elena realized that Hiroshi was caught between traditional Japanese diplomatic culture and the more direct approach that younger Japanese professionals had learned from international business practices. Tanaka-san, what if diplomatic protocol could be maintained while also ensuring clear communication? What if respect could be shown through directness rather than indirectness? Is such a thing possible? In Japanese business culture, showing respect through clear communication is becoming more common, especially in international contexts. You could be leading a cultural evolution rather than violating cultural traditions. The revelations from the individual sessions were striking. Every delegate was struggling with internal cultural tensions that affected their ability to negotiate effectively internationally. They weren't just representing their countries, they were navigating evolving cultural expectations within their countries. Elena compiled her findings into a report that she shared with Catherine and Dr. Harrison. "I think we've been treating culture as if it's static, but it's not. Every delegate is managing cultural change within their own contexts. That's why their positions seem inconsistent. They're trying to balance traditional cultural approaches with evolving international expectations. Dr. Harrison read through Elena's report with growing interest. This is sophisticated cultural analysis, Elena. Have you considered publishing this research? I'm not ready for that yet, but I think these insights could change how we approach the group negotiations. When the delegates reconvened for their next group session, Elena shared her general observations without revealing anything specific from the individual meetings. I've noticed that everyone is managing cultural evolution within their own countries. Traditional approaches to negotiation are being challenged by international business practices, generational changes, and global communication norms. Grace Wanjiku nodded immediately. That's exactly right. In Kenya, our traditional consensus-building practices work well for community decisions, but they're too slow for international business timelines. We're trying to find ways to honor our cultural values while meeting international expectations. Eric Lindquist agreed. In Sweden, our environmental commitments are deeply cultural, but they're being challenged by global economic pressures. We need solutions that feel Swedish but work internationally. Elena felt a surge of excitement. What if we approach these negotiations as cultural innovation rather than cultural preservation? What if each country could develop new ways of expressing their values that also work in international contexts? The shift in the room's energy was immediate. Instead of defending traditional positions, delegates began exploring how their core values could be expressed in new ways. Instead of seeing cultural differences as obstacles, they began treating them as resources for creative problem-solving. The Romanian delegation developed a new approach they called strategic reliability, maintaining their cultural value of consistency while expressing it through flexible commitment to shared goals rather than rigid adherence to specific positions. The Japanese team created respectful directness, honoring their cultural emphasis on harmony while communicating their positions clearly enough for international partners to understand and respond. The Brazilian delegation found ways to frame environmental protection and economic development as complementary rather than competing values, drawing on cultural traditions that saw humans and nature as interconnected systems.
As word of the breakthrough spread through the UN building, Elena found herself at the center of a tension that made her deeply uncomfortable. Diplomats for other negotiations began asking if she could help with their cultural communication challenges. Academic researchers wanted to interview her about her methods. International development organizations inquired about consulting contracts. "I think we need to be careful about how we handle this attention," Catherine warned during one of their weekly planning meetings. "Elena's approach is working because it's authentic and relationship-based. If it becomes a formula or a technique that anyone can apply, it might lose its effectiveness." Dr. Harrison agreed. There's also the question of scaling. Elena's insights work with small groups where she can develop personal relationships with each participant. But what happens when we try to apply this approach to larger, more complex negotiations? Elena had been thinking about the same issues. "I don't think this is about me specifically. I think it's about creating space for cultural reflection in diplomatic processes. What if we trained cultural specialists who could work with negotiating teams the way I've been working with these delegates?" "Cultural diplomacy specialists," Catherine mused. "That could be a new professional field." "It would require people with linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and psychological insight," Dr. Harrison added. "Not everyone has Elena's particular combination of skills." Elena felt a familiar anxiety rising. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I'm trying to do something that can't be systematized. Maybe this only works because of my specific background, and it's not replicable. "Elena," Catherine said firmly, "the fact that your approach can't be easily replicated doesn't make it less valuable. It makes it more valuable." What you've accomplished here isn't just a successful negotiation. It's a proof of concept for a completely different way of approaching international communication. That evening, Elena called Dr. Martinez to discuss an idea that had been growing in her mind. I want to go back to school, not just to finish my dissertation, but to expand it. I want to study what I've learned here, develop a theoretical framework for cultural diplomacy, maybe create a training program. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. Elena, that's a significant commitment. Are you sure you want to leave this work just when you're having such success? I don't want to leave it. I want to understand it better so I can help others do it too. What I've learned over the past month, it's too important to be limited to just my personal abilities. What would you need to make that happen? Elena had been researching exactly that question. A sabbatical arrangement with the State Department, continued access to diplomatic negotiations for research purposes, collaboration with linguistics, psychology, and international relations departments, and a research budget to study how cultural communication affects international cooperation. That sounds like a major research initiative, Elena, the kind of thing that could reshape how people think about diplomacy. That's what scares me. What if I'm not smart enough to do justice to something this important? Martinez laughed. Elena, 3 months ago, you were translating immigration forms in a diner. Now you're facilitating international trade negotiations and developing new theoretical frameworks for cultural diplomacy. I think your intellectual capacity is well established. The next day, Elena presented her proposal to Catherine and Dr. Harrison. She wanted to spend the next 2 years developing a formal research program while continuing to work with diplomatic teams on a consulting basis. She envisioned a collaboration between academic institutions and government agencies that could train cultural specialists and develop best practices for international communication. I want to create something bigger than what I can do alone, Elena explained. A network of people who understand that cultural communication is just as important as political negotiation in international relations. Catherine's response was immediate. Elena, I want to support this proposal, but I also want you to know that what you've accomplished here has already attracted attention from the highest levels of government. The Secretary of State has asked to meet with you. There's talk of creating a new position, maybe even a new department focused on cultural diplomacy. Elena felt her heart racing. The Secretary of State wants to meet with me? Tuesday at 2 p.m. Elena, you have choices to make. You could stay in government and help create new institutional approaches to cultural diplomacy. You could return to academia and develop the theoretical foundation for this work, or you could try to do both.
Elena looked out the window of the conference room, watching delegates from dozens of countries walking through the UN Plaza, each carrying the linguistic and cultural heritage of their people. 6 months ago, she had been serving them coffee and eggs Benedict. Now she was being asked to help reshape how they communicated with each other. "What do you think I should do?" she asked Catherine. "I think you should trust the same instincts that brought you this far. You saw something that everyone else missed, that cultural communication is the foundation of effective diplomacy. Now you have the opportunity to build on that insight. The question is, how do you want to build?" Elena realized that the answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of international cooperation. The waitress who had dropped out of graduate school to pay her mother's medical bills was being asked to help create new ways for nations to understand each other. The responsibility was overwhelming, and it was exactly what she had always dreamed of doing. The meeting with Secretary of State Margaret Chen took place in a corner office that overlooked the East River, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made Elena feel as if she were suspended between the city below and the sky above. Secretary Chen was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from decades of managing international crises. But when she smiled at Elena, her whole face transformed. "Ms. Vasquez, I've been following your work with great interest," Secretary Chen said, gesturing for Elena to sit in one of 2 chairs arranged by the window. "Tell me, What do you think is the most important thing you've learned over the past month? Elena had prepared for this question, but sitting across from one of the most powerful people in American government, her prepared answers felt inadequate. Instead, she found herself speaking from the heart. I learned that most international conflicts aren't really about the issues people are arguing about. They're about people feeling misunderstood, disrespected, or ignored. When you help people feel heard, they become much more willing to find solutions. Secretary Chen nodded. And how do you think that insight could be applied more broadly? I think we need to change how we approach international relations from the ground up. Instead of starting with political positions and trying to negotiate between them, we should start with cultural understanding and build political solutions from there. That would require significant institutional changes. Elena took a deep breath. Yes, ma'am. It would require training diplomats in cultural communication, not just political negotiation. It would require cultural specialists on every negotiating team. It would require recognizing that understanding how people think is just as important as understanding what they want. Secretary Chen leaned back in her chair, studying Elena with the same focused attention Elena had learned to recognize in experienced diplomats. I'm going to ask you a difficult question, Ms. Vasquez. Are you interested in changing how one negotiation works, or are you interested in changing how international relations work? The question hung in the air between them. Elena realized that her answer would determine everything that came next. I want to change how international relations work, Elena said quietly. I think the skills I've been using, cultural communication, linguistic empathy, cross-cultural mediation, I think those should be fundamental parts of diplomatic training, not just special additions to it. Secretary Chen smiled. Then I have a proposal for you. Over the next hour, Secretary Chen outlined a vision that was both exciting and daunting. The State Department wanted to create a new division focused on cultural diplomacy, with Elena as its founding director. They would establish partnerships with universities to develop training programs for cultural communication specialists. They would pilot new approaches to international negotiation that prioritized cultural understanding alongside political agreement. They would create a new professional track for diplomats who specialized in cross-cultural mediation. We're talking about institutionalizing the work you've been doing, creating systems and processes that can train others to do what you do intuitively, Secretary Chen explained. Elena felt overwhelmed. Secretary Chen, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to direct the government division. 6 weeks ago, I was waiting tables. Elena, may I call you Elena? Secretary Chen's voice became warmer, more personal. 6 weeks ago, you were using advanced linguistic and cultural skills to help people solve problems and build understanding. You were doing cultural diplomacy. You just weren't calling it that. Secretary Chen shared her own story then, how she had started as a translator for trade delegations 30 years ago, how she had gradually realized that successful international relations required understanding not just what people said, but what they meant. Not just their official positions, but their cultural contexts. The difference between us, Secretary Chen said, is that I learned those skills over 30 years of trial and error. You seem to understand them intuitively. That's something we can't afford to waste.
Elena left the meeting with a thick folder of materials to review and 2 weeks to make a decision. The proposed position would involve establishing new training programs, developing cultural assessment protocols for international negotiations, and creating a network of cultural specialists who could support diplomatic teams around the world. That evening, Elena called her mother for their daily check-in, but found herself struggling to explain the magnitude of the opportunity she was facing. "Mija, you sound overwhelmed," her mother said gently. "Mama, they want me to create a new government program. They want me to train other people to do what I've been doing. What if I don't know enough? What if I make mistakes that affect international relations?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Elena, do you remember when you were 8 and you helped Mrs. Garcia understand the school nurse when Rosa was sick?" Elena smiled, despite her anxiety. "You've told me that story 100 times. And do you remember what I said to you then? That helping people understand each other is a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared." "That's right. This is just Mrs. Garcia and the school nurse, but bigger. The same gift, the the same purpose. Elena spent the next week visiting the diner where her journey had started. Marco greeted her with a huge hug and insisted she sit in her old section while he made her lunch. "You look different," Jamal observed, sliding into the booth across from her. "More like you belong in fancy places." "I don't know if I belong anywhere yet," Elena admitted. "They want me to start a whole new program, train other people to do cultural diplomacy. But what if what I do only works because of my specific background? What if it can't be taught?" Mrs. Petrov, now a regular who had become like a grandmother to the entire staff, overheard the conversation and joined them. "Elena, dear, you think you are a special case, yes? But I watch you with others. You teach me English. You teach Mrs. Chen Spanish. You teach that young man Arabic. You always teaching, always helping others learn to communicate. This is not an accident. This is skill." That afternoon, Elena walked through her old neighborhood, stopping at the Ethiopian restaurant where Almaz greeted her with coffee and injera bread. They spoke in Amharic about changes in the community, about Almaz's daughter who was now applying to colleges, about the ways the neighborhood had evolved since Elena had become a regular presence 3 years earlier. "You know what I notice," Almaz said as Elena prepared to leave. "When you first started helping people here, everyone thought you were special, different. But then, people started helping each other more. Mrs. Kim teaches Spanish to Mr. Lopez. The Polish man is learning Arabic from the Syrian family. You didn't just translate, you showed people how to translate." Elena realized that Almaz had identified something crucial about her approach. She didn't just solve communication problems, she modeled how to solve them, creating an environment where others began developing cross-cultural communication skills. That revelation shaped her decision about Secretary Chen's offer. Elena called Catherine to schedule a meeting, but instead of accepting the position as proposed, she came with a counter-proposal. "I want to take the job, but I want to modify the approach. Instead of creating a new government division, I want to establish a partnership between the State Department and universities. I want to spend half my time in government working with diplomatic teams and half my time in academia developing training programs and conducting research." Catherine looked intrigued. Why the academic component? "Because if we're going to change how international relations work, we need people who understand that every negotiation is really about human connection," Elena said with quiet confidence. 6 months later, Elena launched the first Cultural Diplomacy Institute, training a new generation of translators who would bridge not just languages, but entire worlds. If this story inspired you, please like and subscribe for more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Your support helps us find and share these amazing journeys that prove anything is possible.